Good afternoon, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to News in Focus. My name is Faraz Patel. Would like to thank you, the viewer, for staying with us here on Hilaal TV, DSTV channel 347. Donald Trump, President Cyril Ramaphosa, South Africa, the United States, Washington, and Pretoria. This is as a bigger diplomatic row than you may ever see in the history between these two countries. This, of course, comes on the new expropriation law, which was signed just last month. It's angered President Donald Trump, who's decided to go ahead and take a stance and stop any funding in terms of medical help to South Africa. And of course, he has the backing of none other than Elon Musk. Enter AfriForum, and of course, they've been complaining with regards to that, and accusations have been flying that AfriForum has been acting as a sort of de facto agent for Washington in trying to, quote-unquote, overthrow the government. Joining me now, I'd like to welcome the Director for Social Change, I beg your pardon, at the University of Johannesburg. It is none other than Professor Patrick Bond. Prof, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us.
Assalamu alaikum. It's so nice to be back with you.
Walaikum salam. It's an absolute pleasure. Professor Bond, I don't know who's going to dissect the mind of Donald Trump. I'd like to think good luck to the person who does that. But listening to his rhetoric, man, oh man, this is as a bigger diplomatic row as we've ever seen before.
That's correct. The most intense period of conflict between the white South African regime and the United States was in 1993 when Bill Clinton, the Democrat, had entered office and felt that things should speed up, and he had a very close relationship with Nelson Mandela. But particularly the Congress and the people of the United States hated apartheid and worked very hard for sanctions during the 1980s. I was one of them. That's where I learned my politics. And I think the comparison to today is extraordinary. We did see in 2018 when Donald Trump, after a year in office, said that he believed there was a white farmer genocide underway because he'd heard, again, from the likes of the AfriForums, that there were farm murders. Of course, there are, and it's tragic, and they're associated typically with petty crime or some revenge. But I mean, there's no, obviously, genocide, and there's no land reform worth speaking of in terms of the expropriation. There is a little bit, about 10% of the land since 1994, but that's been mostly state land or willing seller, willing buyer, in which the white farmers or corporate farmers have been bought off, and then resettlement occurred. The expropriation is much like the United States, which has an eminent domain concept. That is, if a state, a government in either the national or the state level need to get access to land to put a road in or a bridge or to do something infrastructurally, then it does an expropriation. And that's really what this current law is about, and nothing much more, because we know until we have a really serious rural social movement, a movement of small farmers, a movement of angry, let's say, rural dwellers who are not getting much. They do service delivery protests, but until they focus on access to land, say the way the Brazilians have, or Nicaraguans when they had their revolution, or the Vietnamese, or even the Koreans in the 1950s. Until we have that sort of social movement from below in the rural areas, even Zimbabwe didn't quite have it. It had to be sort of recreated, but then it picked up with the land reform there, the Jambanja, after 2000. Until we see that in South Africa, this is really just a sort of a red herring from Trump, and especially Elon Musk, and then comes the Secretary of State, their foreign minister, who has just refused to come to the G20 foreign ministers meeting, and his name is Marco Rubio. These three characters, with their backroom advisors, hinted at by AfriForum and perhaps the Orania leadership, they've really made a big mistake by making land reform their target, because it's not happening.
Prof. Bond, misinformation, because you've just mentioned it, willing buyer, willing seller. If anybody goes through the Land Expropriation Act, it specifically mentions that for public use. So somehow Donald Trump is either he understands it and refuses outright to look at it on fine print, or one of his advisors are telling him, listen, this is what's happening. They're just grabbing land for the sake of it, and we should just cut every supposed tie with South Africa. And there's a third aspect, some misinformation is being interpreted by AfriForum. I mean, this in itself is dangerous grounds for any supposed relationship that Washington and Pretoria had worked so well for.
Yes, under the Biden administration, there was a lot of conflict over a couple of things. One was the accusation, and I think very valid, that there was a genocide by Israel underway in Palestine, and that went to the International Court of Justice, where it remains, and it may, hopefully come to some sort of resolution in months ahead, as with the International Criminal Court, where, again, the South African government, part of a large number of groups, in fact, the Palestinian Authority, starting this one, saying that Benjamin Netanyahu and his former defense minister needed to have war crimes charges, and therefore there was an arrest warrant issued. And so those have been what, let's say, the last few months, that you remember as well, the U.S. ambassador, Ruben Brigetti, under Joe Biden, had accused South Africa of loading arms on a ship in Simonstown back in December 2022. They never showed proof. South Africa denied it. Brigetti continued until the end of his days as ambassador to say, oh, there was something going on. But what we're now seeing is a complete flip, in the sense that when you look at a new regime like this coming into power, you expect a lot of foreign policy changes, but the complete chaos that extends from the potential takeover by military force, not ruled out, of Greenland, the attempt to bring Canada in as a 51st state against the will of the Canadian people, the claim that the Panama Canal will be taken back by the United States, conflict with the Colombian government over sending refugees, well, let's say the mass deportation, including to Colombia, the use of Cuba, the Guantanamo Bay, the U.S. military base, to put what Trump promises could be 30,000 refugees. These are extraordinary violations of standard foreign policy. And what we are now seeing, I think, in South Africa's case, and also with threats to the BRICS, of course, major threats to China, and on Monday, the imposition of tariffs, 25% tariffs on all imported aluminium and steel, that not only hit South Africa, but many other countries who are exporting to the U.S., plus the threat to put on 100% tariffs on the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and 5 others who have been talking very vaguely about an alternative to the US dollar. All of these represent a man, Donald Trump, who's out of control. He usually is tempered to some extent by the forces of capital around him. And in this case, we're looking at 2 major forces that really are getting what they want, but not really in the foreign policy realm, because it's just chaos. And then the 2 are big tech and Elon Musk, born in Pretoria, raised a bit in Johannesburg at Bryanston High School. He was bullied and, thrown down a couple of steps of stairs and, beat up again, and then put in hospital as a result for 2 weeks. So kind of having a big chip on his shoulder from his Joburg years, and then going to Pretoria Boys, leaving in just before he would have had to have gone into the SADF. And he's obviously the string puller on all these sorts of things. Ramaphosa trying last week to speak to him, not getting anywhere. And he has one agenda which coincides with Trump's agenda. By the way, the other faction of capital that's really happy right now are the banks, because they are pulling away from their commitments not to finance climate change through big carbon-related investments, but also they love austerity, and the austerity, the chops in the U.S. budget are extreme. So Musk, the big budget cutter, is happy with the banks. But what he really wants as well from South Africa, he wants to do business through Starlink without a black partner. Sure. And he'd have to kind of give up about a third of his capital into whatever profits he had anticipated for South Africa by putting up a satellite for internet. Now, whether you want Elon Musk in charge of putting data from all of us in South Africa into his data banks, I don't think so. But he's already come into huge controversy.
I have to stop you there. We have to go to the break, but it's a classic case of the bullied Musk now wants to be the bully here in South Africa. After the break, I continue my conversation with Professor Patrick Bond, discussing the diplomatic and economic spat between Pretoria and Washington. Do stay tuned. Welcome back to News in Focus. I'm still in conversation with Professor Patrick Bond, Director for Social Change at the University of Johannesburg. Now, Prof. Bond, dealing with Donald Trump is like dealing with a spoiled a teenager, or actually dealing with a child that just outright does not want to listen to you. How does South Africa approach this? Because you've got President Cyril Ramaphosa, who's seen as a diplomat. You've got the rest of his cabinet that are seen with his diplomat, but they, quite frankly, are fed up with the way Donald Trump and the rest of his big tech partners are acting at this moment. And then, of course, you've got Ibrahim Rasool, who is sitting in Washington, scratching his head on how to deal with this current situation. I mean, one's got to feel it for the South African cabinet, but man, don't they have their work cut out for them right now?
They do, because just as I was saying that Elon Musk wants something out of this, these are transactional, corporate profiteers. So when they make these claims, especially about diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI, if they make claims about South Africa, it's partly their racism, partly their opportunism for Elon Musk, the desire not to give the Black Empowerment Partner a chunk of his Starlink if it gets up and running in South Africa. Let me just explicitly say that the racism in the Trump administration against diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, right, those three letters that they are all up in the air about, it really simply boils down to affirmative action. Let me quote the Secretary of State. I will not attend the G20 summit in Johannesburg. South Africa is doing very bad things, expropriating private property, using G20 to promote solidarity, equality, and sustainability. In other words, DEI and climate change, end quote. That was his tweet last week, and his, let's say, conversion from being a neoconservative to becoming a Trump isolationist as the Secretary of State is one of the extraordinary ideological shifts in this. And now we get to the ideology of South Africa and the strategy. Our ideology in running the G20 has been to get along and go along. And you've seen that since even in Rio last year, I attended the G20 and saw very clearly how, although with President Lula, the left-wing president of Brazil, there was a fair bit of rhetoric about exactly solidarity, equality, and sustainability. President Ramaphosa gave a speech to the G20 saying, don't use food as a weapon of war. And yet at the very same time, his minister in the presidency, Njaveni, was saying, smoke them out to Stilfontein miners who are being starved to death. And literally, scores of them did die of starvation deep in the mine under Stilfontein, a massacre of if not 87, as claimed, probably well over 100 because of the bodies we won't know. So let me just start by saying this hypocrisy when it comes to let's say, a just world will be on full display. And Marco Rubio, I think, was silly not to go in there to take advantage of that and pretend that the Trump regime can play ball with the other G20. And what it leads to is this interesting question, well, what do you do? And what Ramaphosa started by doing in 2018 was Mugabe-style populism. He said, after the claims about white genocide on the farms, he said, no, you have your America, we have our South Africa, just like Robert Mugabe did to Tony Blair 20 years earlier. Now, the other crucial point about what this, let's say, evolution of broad balance of forces and ideologies represents is the, let's say, rise of this right-wing ideology, paleoconservatism it is called, populist nationalism, which does mean a retreat, as I said, isolationism and protectionism, massive xenophobia with that the deportation of 11 million, mostly Mexican Americans and others, Haitians and other Central and South Americans. And then you've got the neocons who do, just as you saw Trump claiming he would do to Gaza, bring democracy. And just like they did with Libya, with Afghanistan, with Iraq, Syria, they just make a terrible mess of their imposition of democracy through the barrel of the gun as neocons. And I see Trump fusing both of those and a third ideology of the ruling class, which is neoliberalism, which is budget cutting and deregulation and getting any rules off of big capital. That's where you see Musk. So if you've got Trump and his main neo or paleocon colleague, Steve Bannon, and you've got the neocon represented by Rubio, and you've got the neoliberal, these three powerful right-wing ideologies, Elon Musk, and they all hate South Africa, and race is part of it. I don't think you can do what Ramaphosa has been doing since December. he said at the first hint of big tariffs against South Africa, I'll take Donald Trump out for a game of golf, and he'll get a state visit in November here in Johannesburg.
Sure.
And that to me is kowtowing or bootlicking, when a bully really needs to be told in no uncertain terms, we can toss you out of the G20 because of your behavior. We'll try to toss you out of the United Nations for walking out of the climate negotiations and the World Health Organization. And we'll start a boycott, divestment, sanctions. And we'll start with Elon Musk, Starlink, Tesla, and for some of us,
President, sorry, I have to bring in this question. I was listening to Thabo Mbeki on the state broadcast at the SABC, and he mentioned quite convincingly saying that, listen, South Africa has enjoyed, even post-1994, good relationships with Republican presidents. Of course, the only Republican president I can think of at that time was, of course, George W. Bush. And, of course, this was the same president that sent U.S. troops to Afghanistan and Iraq. Why is South Africa struggling with this Republican president? Is Donald Trump just a hard, flat-out bully who will not listen to anyone or anything as long as he satisfies his capitalistic gains and, of course, those of the tech industry?
Absolutely. This is the dilemma. And do you deal with a bully of that sort by offering him, as did the presidency last week, another game of golf and say, no, President Ramaphosa will take off time to get a better this is just literally hours after Netanyahu and Trump said we're going to have ethnic cleansing of Gaza. So that's the kowtowing. The second approach you could take is to say, well, just by ourselves, we don't like what Trump is doing. But unfortunately, those leaders who've done so have found themselves divided and conquered. And it really is time to do something like the Hague group, which was about 2 weeks ago. South Africa led Colombia and Malaysia and 6 others, Namibia, Cuba, a few others, to say we will support the International Criminal Court against the US. And I think that collective approach is where we need to start talking, especially if we do begin boycott, divestment, sanctions. This has been called for by the South African Federation of Trade Unions, climate activists, Canadians who won't drink another drop of Kentucky bourbon, right? That terrible sweet whiskey that they drink there. So there's a very interesting moment to say delegitimization of Trump. And I think asking if Trump doesn't want to come to the G20, good riddance. And then the rest of the people who do meet on February 20 and 21, the location might be Nasrec, might be Sandton Convention Center, but those ministers who do meet can now start running quickly. And then one of the proposals to me would be logical, take the US out of the G20. They had tried that once before with Russia in 2014. Too many states blocked that. But I think in this case, Trump has made enemies with everyone, and we should take advantage of that.
Yeah, I want to touch on that enemies because he's upset Justin Trudeau. The European Union seems to be very angry with Donald Trump because of the tariffs that he wants to impose. We've got now China who's going to make a state visit to the United Kingdom this week, and who knows what might happen there. Is he isolating himself? Can the United States of America really isolate themselves on this island right now? And are they really heading for a disaster given that Donald Trump and his stubbornness is going to be the order of the day right now?
Absolutely. This is the game plan that has been, let's say, rolled out as Trump promised and threatened since day one. The attacks are not just the U.S. against everyone, because within the U.S. there's a civil war brewing and hundreds and hundreds of protests are occurring. In fact, probably more than 100 a day against the budget cuts that are coming down and the end of programs that are very vital, even to Donald Trump's own base. So if you look at the so-called MAGA, Make America Great Again, the working class and often white, poor people of the South. I happen to grow up in a place, Alabama, so I know those people, and they expect there to be some daycare, to be some food stamps, and to be some Medicare, which is healthcare for poor people, Medicaid for poor people, Medicare for elderly people. So to actually tear out a big chunk of the U.S. standard of living of Trump's own supporters will probably be part of this and the downfall. And the debate I think we should be having is, how do we do the kind of solidarity with people of the U.S. who are going to be suffering that the people of the U.S. gave to the people of South Africa when apartheid meant there was so much suffering. And it might mean that as many progressives in the US go into jail, go into exile. Well, South Africa should lend a hand and make it very clear from the beginning. If you're fighting Donald Trump because you're a woman who may need reproductive rights, if you're Mexican who might have not had all the right papers when you started to work dozens of years ago in the US, if you're LGBTQI, if you are a working class person and dependent upon a trade union, if you're a civil servant, because all of them have been given the potential firing notice, you can resign in 8 months of pay. All of these oppressed people in the US, especially African Americans who have such strong links to South Africa, I think we should be reaching out to and saying, Johannesburg is an exile city with a trendy address, the way Doha, Qatar is at the moment for Middle Eastern activists who found it okay in Beirut, but once the Israelis started mass murdering and killing with targeted weapons, they moved, as I witnessed when I was in Doha not too long ago. I think we do have that responsibility to be the leader and not to invite Donald Trump in for a game of golf.
One final question, we've got 1 minute, Professor Bond. Is the United States of America heading or moving slowly away from the democracy that was fought so hard by the likes of John F. Kennedy and Abraham Lincoln, to mention a few? I've got just 45 seconds from you, Professor.
Yes, and the dilemma is that the courts are the first line of defense, and that especially J.D. Vance, the vice president, has no regard and says we don't have to take seriously the recent court orders. They came down on Sunday to stop many of the worst excesses in the United States. The U.S. is therefore cutting edge at the world level of fascism, right? And we have to understand that and not pretend that there's some Hitler running around you can negotiate with the way the Brits tried in the early 30s. You actually have to take a strong stand and delegitimize Trump right at the outset. I hope Ramaphosa gets that message very quickly, because a game of golf doesn't impress anyone.
Okay, well, of course, if they were to offer him Augusta, I'm sure he wouldn't mind, but even Augusta wouldn't go ahead and satisfy Donald Trump. Professor Bond, always a pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be with you.
That's Professor Patrick Bond, Director for Social Change at the University of Johannesburg. Up next, we're going to try and connect to Nhlanhla Ndlela, the MK Party spokesperson. Just yesterday, they opened up a case of treason against AfriForum. Do stay tuned.